Hello everyone, welcome to this mini series about project estimates, and on this video I'm going to talk about estimating uncertainty. So let's first talk about project estimates. What is a project estimate? It's a quantitative assessment of the likely amount or outcome of something. That means that we put a number on it, that we have to quantify it. Usually it's applied to project costs, resources, efforts, and durations. So the terms here that a lot of times when you see estimates, they're going to have different names, and I just made a list here about some names that are very common to hear. And every time you hear one of these words, it basically means that it's an estimate. Therefore, it's a prediction, okay? Words, for example, like preliminary, visibility, order of magnitude, and budget, this is all terms that describe the same thing, which means estimates, predictions about the future. So they are seldomly precise, and normally we need to use them with a measurement of accuracy to express how accurate our estimates actually are. And accuracy will depend upon many things, but mostly the accuracy of our estimates will depend upon the uncertainty of the task and upon the type of task that we are trying to do. There's four major types of tasks that we have to predict, and let's start with the easiest one. We call this the standard tasks. Now, this is tasks that are clearly defined and we understand them very well, and there's very little uncertainty about the task itself, which means there's a very high probability that our estimates are correct. So if you were to represent them, it would look like, on this graph, it would look like this, a very high likelihood that our estimate is correct, and it would be on a very short span there. So what you see there is that, so we have only one prediction. It's the most likely approach, the most likely value, and there's a very low risk in this approach because we are very sure about what this task is. And so our target is right there, is that value that we would use. So what is the number that we put? Typically, we put the average value that we get, and we use that average value to set the estimate for this task. The second type of tasks we call them dependent tasks. Now, this is tasks that we clearly understand the activity, but it's not clearly defined. There's a difference between the previous one. And why is that? Because this task depends upon a factor that is not known or that I cannot control. And in this case, what we tend to do is that this task will be affected by something, and so therefore, in a simpler manner, it could look something like this. What does this mean? It means, okay, if things go well, then I have my first estimate. If things don't go so well, I have my second estimate here. And therefore, what does this mean? It means that the first estimate is, if things go well, I can have a more aggressive approach. But this estimate, because I'm saying that I require less effort to do that task, has a higher risk of failure, has a higher risk that it will be wrong. The second approach is the more conservative approach, and on this case we have a lower risk that this estimate would be wrong. So what should we do in a situation like this? We need to manage the factor that will affect my decision and then make a decision upon which approach should we take. I typically take the more conservative approach because normally when I manage projects, I feel like if things can go wrong, they will go wrong. So I try to predict the worst case scenario. The third type of tasks we call them uncertain tasks. Uncertain task is when the scope or the effort is not very clear about what we have to do or how much time we're going to have to do it for. And this task will depend upon many factors that at the moment I either don't know or I cannot control. So technically, if we were to look about distribution of probability, it would look like a line like this. And here what I do is I try to come up with four different estimates. The first one over there, I would say it's the best case scenario, and therefore if it's the best case scenario, I say it's the least amount of effort I could possibly ask for, and therefore I would have the highest risk in this one. The second one that I have, we call it the most likely approach, and this one has a moderate risk. I'll come back to this one in a little bit. The third one, we call it the 80% case, and it has low risk as well. And the fourth one is the worst case scenario, and therefore is the highest estimate, the lowest possible risk. So how do I normally use this model? First, I determine the best case scenario, then I determine the worst case scenario. And now I have a range. Now I know that my task has to be, the effort of this task has to be between these two. All right, then between these two, 80% of the cases, what does normally happen? What would be a safer, not the worst case scenario, but a little bit safer? And then I determine between these two. So in this case, when I say between these two, I'm talking about this one and this one. It means that normally I have the most likely case, and then I would try to determine what is the most likely case. Okay, now in terms of management here, what happens is what you have to do is to stretch your goal a little bit more and then micromanage this task. You have to be very careful with this task because there's so many things that will affect it, and therefore if you don't micromanage it, you can easily end up in a worst case scenario. The last type of task we have is called unknown tasks. And unknown tasks, like the name indicates, you don't know about them. This is tasks that you will have to do in the future, but you don't know yet that you're going to have to do it. So here we don't have scope and we don't have deliverable, obviously, because this is things we're going to have to do during the project we could not predict. And therefore, these tasks are uncontrollable. So what do you do in terms of estimate? How it would look like? Well, it would like a big interrogation point. You don't know, you cannot predict, and you cannot set effort estimates. So what do you do in a situation like this? Always set a reserve, both in time and in money for your project, for these tasks that you could not predict you would have to do. So to summarize, we learned there are 4 different types of tasks, and each one will have a different approach on the way that you should estimate them. Okay, the more unknown things we have in a task, the harder it will be to estimate it, obviously, but most of the tasks fall under the first category, the ones that we can easily predict. Okay, hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you on the next video for this mini series.